few weeks ago, I met a friend for coffee, a senior designer named Marcus. He was genuinely buzzing, telling me about his new role. His manager had just given him total self-leadership over a massive rebranding project. No check-ins, no rigid hierarchies, just Marcus at the helm. He looked like he'd finally been handed the keys to the kingdom. He kept using words like empowerment and radical autonomy, his eyes wide with the thrill of being his own master. But when we met again last Tuesday, the light in his eyes had been replaced by a sort of hollow, thousand-yard stare. He described a week of chaos, 3 different departments giving him contradictory priority 1 tasks, a budget that didn't match the vision, and a complete lack of strategic direction from above. When he finally went to his boss for a tie-breaking decision, the response was a pat on the back and a breezy, "I trust your self-leadership to figure it out." Watching Narcus struggle to find his footing in that vacuum, I realized that his autonomy wasn't a gift, it was a ghosting. He hadn't been empowered, he'd been abandoned. It's a scene playing out in offices everywhere. We've turned self-leadership into a secular religion, a heroic ideal of the self-governing professional. But if you look closely at the cracks, you start to see something more cynical. We tell people to be the masters of their own destiny, while the structures around them are crumbling or, worse, non-existent. It raises a question we usually try to ignore. Is this noble autonomy actually just a clever way to make you feel guilty for failing in a system that was never designed for you to succeed? Are we building independent leaders or just training people to survive a modern form of professional shipwreck?
And, to really understand the architecture of that shipwreck, we have to look at the people who are actually drowning in it. Take Elena, for example.
Yeah, right, Elena in Berlin.
Yeah, exactly. She's a senior project lead at this really high-growth logistics firm over in Berlin. And they went through this period of massive executive turnover, basically a total leadership vacuum at the top.
Which is always a red flag.
Oh, huge red flag.
Yeah.
But instead of fixing it, the company hands her what they formerly called a self-leadership mandate.
It's just, it's such a sleek piece of corporate branding, isn't it? They take a structural deficit, like having no executives to actually direct things, and they package it as a promotion.
It's brilliant in a really dark way. But the reality of that mandate for Elena looked like this. It's Tuesday, 3 a.m. She's sitting completely alone in her apartment.
The worst time to be awake.
Right. The only light is this harsh, clinical blue glow from her monitor, just casting these long shadows on her wall. And the coffee next to her went cold, like hours ago.
And she's just staring at a screen?
Staring at a completely blank spreadsheet. This grid is supposed to hold this cohesive, actionable supply chain strategy for the next fiscal year. But the board of directors, who, remember, aren't really leading right now, have handed down entirely contradictory directives.
What?
Well, they simultaneously demanded drastically lower logistical costs, significantly faster delivery times because they want to outpace a new competitor, and a complete overhaul of the supply chain to get a smaller carbon footprint, all at once, to be implemented immediately. And oh yeah, with a budget that was just slashed by 20%.
I mean, that's just a mathematical impossibility. You can't do fast, cheap, and green with 20% less money.
It is a closed loop of contradictions.
Yeah.
But because she's been given this, self-leadership mandate, the burden of resolving that unsolvable equation falls entirely on her shoulders, isolated in her apartment at 3 a.m.
So she's basically absorbing all the dysfunction of the entire executive board.
And when she previously tried to go to management to just clarify these competing priorities, you know what they told her.
Guess. Figure it out.
They politely deflected and told her to navigate the ambiguity through her own internal compass.
Wow.
Yeah. So sitting there in the early hours, Elena isn't just failing to produce a spreadsheet. The physical sensation she's having is this crushing, profound shame.
Because she thinks it's her fault.
Right. The vulnerability she feels has absolutely nothing to do with a lack of skill. It stems from the fact that she genuinely believes she is failing. She thinks she lacks the grit or the discipline to self-lead her way out of a structural trap.
That is so heavy.
Later that year, the company actually gave her a physical self-leadership award.
Kidding.
She described it to researchers as this heavy glass tombstone sitting on her desk. A desk she was literally too paralyzed by exhaustion to even clear off.
So they replaced clear management with an award.
They replaced rational decision-making with a mirror. Every time she looked for systemic support, the system just reflected the gaze back onto her, demanding she look deeper within herself.
I really want to pull on that thread, that mirror mechanism, because it fundamentally redefines what leadership even is. Like, In Spanish business literature, there's this term you see a lot, autoliderazgo.
Right, self-leadership.
Yeah, but it carries this deeper connotation of like self-mastery, being the absolute sovereign of your professional domain. And it's so seductive because it totally flatters the ego.
Absolutely. It tells you that you're elite.
Right. It suggests you're capable and beyond the need for traditional management. But in practice, as we just saw with Elena, autoliderazgo functions as this elegant trick for management abdication. The implicit message is you must generate your own motivation, prioritize your tasks, and manage your own psychology while staring down a brick wall of contradictions.
And the psychological outcome of that trick is what sociologists call structural loneliness. Because true self-leadership, the kind that historically drives actual innovation, doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right, you need a foundation.
Exactly. It requires a highly stable, intelligible structure beneath it. It requires visible leadership above you, making rational decisions about resources. When you remove that framework and demand self-leadership in a total void, the individual just becomes a shock absorber.
Just absorbing all the ambient uncertainty.
All the volatility, all the strategic failures of the system, it all hits the individual.
And it completely weaponizes the narrative of resilience, doesn't it? I mean, think about the traits we admire. They get deployed as this preventive ethics against criticism.
What do you mean by preventive ethics?
Like if an employee like Elena burns out or fails to deliver that impossible strategy, the autopsy of that failure never looks at the board's ridiculous directives.
Right, it never points up.
Actually, the blame is surgically placed on her lack of focus or her poor time management. The structural flaws are invisible because everyone has already accepted the premise that success or failure is entirely a product of her own self-leadership.
It's a closed ideological system. The organization can literally never be at fault.
Third, if you apply it to a physical scenario, it's like, okay, imagine giving someone contextless autonomy by putting them in the driver's seat of a car. You hand them the steering wheel, you tell them they are completely empowered to choose the destination, and you praise their freedom. Right, but you've secretly removed the engine, siphoned out the gas, and thrown the map out the window.
And then what?
Well, when the car inevitably fails to move, you just stand outside the window, patting them on the shoulder, suggesting they simply aren't steering hard enough, or that their internal motivation to drive is lacking.
That is the perfect analogy, because it shows this isn't just a management error. It's a highly calculated structural shift in where the responsibility for failure actually resides.
And that shift didn't just happen overnight, did it?
Well, it has deep, deep philosophical roots. To really grasp how organizations have actively colonized our inner lives, we have to look at another story. Think about Marcus. Not your friend Marcus, but a different Marcus, an architect at a mid-sized firm in London.
Okay, another Marcus. What happened to him?
Well, for years, Marcus had this really rigorous private practice of Stoicism. He would read Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, and he used these classical tools of self-governance to just, manage his private anxiety, to find an ethical grounding.
Which is what classical self-governance was meant for, right? It was never designed as a mechanism for corporate output. The ancient schools were about ordering your life around virtue and valuable ends, independent of external demand.
Exactly. It was about moral survival.
Yeah.
But Marcus's architecture firm went through a restructuring, and they rolled out this new self-governance framework.
Oh, yes.
They basically observed the private, spiritual coping mechanisms of their highest performers, like Marcus, and they harvested them. His quiet personal practice of Stoicism was repackaged by management as a series of performance resilience KPIs.
Wow. So his ability to remain calm under pressure wasn't just his own private virtue anymore.
No, it was a tracked metric required for him to keep his job. They breached the boundary between doing your job and the inner sanctum of how you psychologically survive.
What happens when you fail a resilience KPI?
Well, we saw it during his next quarterly review. The firm had just executed this brutal 30% staff cut to boost profit margins, so the remaining architects were carrying a mathematically impossible workload.
Just like Elena's situation.
Exactly. And during the review, Marcus's manager didn't talk about the structural flaws of the project timelines. He didn't mention the obvious lack of manpower. Instead, he looked across the table and questioned Marcus's internal alignment.
He actually used those words, internal alignment.
He suggested that if Marcus were truly practicing the self-governance the firm demanded, he would be able to mitigate the stress of the workload.
So they fired 30% of the staff, piled the work on him, and when he stressed out, they told him he just wasn't being stoic enough.
Marcus resigned shortly after that meeting, and he described this really specific, nauseating sensation. the profound violation of seeing his most private spiritual tools turned into a cheap productivity hack.
Because the company had no interest in him as a human being.
Right. They colonized his inner life just to avoid the financial cost of hiring adequate staff.
That nauseating sensation he felt, it just highlights the total friction between classical self-governance and this modern corporate obsession with permanent self-optimization. They took a philosophy for moral survival and twisted it into an efficiency engine for capital extraction.
It really weaponizes the human desire for mastery.
It does, and to understand the mechanics of how we even arrived at a point where a boss can demand internal alignment, we really need to look at the evolution of power itself.
Which brings us to Michel Foucault. If we want the most precise framework for this, it's Foucault's concept of governmentality.
Right, the portmanteau of government and rationality.
Exactly. He used it to describe the conduct of conduct. Basically, he traced this massive historical shift in how humans are controlled. Like, think back to the Middle Ages. The state exerted power in a blunt, highly visible way. Sovereign power.
Right, the rule of the king, obey or face the dungeon.
Oh, the scaffold, yeah.
Okay.
It was coercive, external, and highly theatrical. The mechanism of control was physical threat. The king commands, you comply out of terror.
But obviously we don't work under the threat of the lash anymore.
Right, because modern neoliberal governmentality operates totally differently. Foucault realized that overt coercion is actually economically inefficient, and it sparks rebellions. So modern control relies on what he called technologies of the self.
Meaning the system doesn't force you to work?
Exactly. It induces you to become an enterprising, calculating self. The architecture of power shifts from an external threat to an internal aspiration. You voluntarily align your personal desires and your identity with institutional objectives. You become the agent of your own subjugation.
You govern yourself on behalf of the system.
And the brilliance and the horror of it is that it feels like freedom. You aren't working 60-hour weeks because someone is holding a sword to your neck. You're doing it because you've internalized the narrative that to be a valuable person, you must constantly optimize your output.
The external boss is replaced by an internal taskmaster who literally never sleeps.
And a contemporary philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, expands on Foucault to diagnose our exact present moment. Han argues in his work on the Achievement Society that we've actually moved past Foucault's disciplinary society.
Because the disciplinary society was all about shoulds and should nots, right? Prisons, hospitals, barracks, external prohibition.
Right. But the modern achievement model is driven entirely by internal cans. Limitless potential. The modern worker sees themselves as an entrepreneur of the self. So because the pressure comes from within, from this manufactured sense of limitless capacity, we voluntarily exploit ourselves without any external constraints.
And Han says that voluntary self-exploitation is the root cause of burnout.
The ultimate pathology of our era.
It makes me think of the panopticon. You know, Jeremy Bentham's prison design that Foucault wrote about, where one guard in a central tower can watch any prisoner in a circle of cells.
Right, and because the prisoners can't see the guard, they have to assume they're always being watched.
Exactly. They internalize the surveillance. That's the apex of the old disciplinary world. But Han's Achievement Society, it's a shift from the panopticon to what we could call the omniopticon.
The omniopticon.
Yeah, because in the omniopticon, there is no central tower. There is no guard at all. You have internalized the guard so completely that the tower just resides inside your own mind. And the chilling efficiency of that system is that organized rebellion becomes structurally impossible.
Because who are you going to rebel against?
Exactly. You can't stage a labor strike against your own ambitions. You can't form a union against your own desire for self-optimization. The oppressor and the oppressed are the exact same person.
And that philosophical shift is manifesting so tangibly in our daily work environments right now. Researchers who study organizational behavior see this constantly. They call it the autonomy paradox.
Which is incredibly evident in remote work. Right. Remote work was initially championed as this ultimate liberation of the professional class. Untethering us from the physical office was supposed to mean unprecedented freedom.
But the reality totally contradicts that assumption. The autonomy paradox is the observation that employees, given high degrees of autonomy like choosing when and where they work, ironically end up intensifying their own work practices.
They lose the structural ability to disconnect.
The data consistently shows that highly autonomous knowledge workers actually work longer hours with greater intensity and take fewer breaks than they would in a traditional, highly supervised office.
Which just reveals the psychosocial hazards embedded in knowledge work. Because the organization retreated from physical surveillance, they need a new way to extract value. I mean, sure, we see clumsy attempts at surveillance like keystroke logging software.
Right, or webcam monitoring. But those are throwbacks to disciplinary power, and they're so easily subverted.
Oh, yeah, people just buy mouse jigglers.
Exactly. The mouse jiggler is such a fascinating artifact. It physically moves the mouse to simulate activity while you step away. It's direct physical resistance to an outdated form of power. It proves that when power is external, humans will naturally find ways to subvert it.
But the truly sophisticated organizations don't use keystroke loggers. They abandon them. Instead, they rely on the rhetoric of trust. They give you the laptop and say, we trust your self-leadership. Work whenever you want as long as the results are there.
And what's the psychological response to that? Profound gratitude.
Right. To repay that organizational trust, the worker offers up massive amounts of discretionary overwork. The boundary between the professional sphere and the domestic sphere just evaporates. Your living room becomes your office. Sunday evening is just pre-Monday.
And the burden of managing that pseudo-autonomy isn't just psychological. It has severe, measurable biological consequences. To understand the physical toll of this autonomy paradox, we have to look at the concept of allostatic load.
Allostatic load.
Yeah. The human body operates as a meticulous, unforgiving accountant. Every time you have to self-lead through a systemic failure, every time you blur a boundary to accommodate an impossible directive, your body experiences chronic, low-grade stress.
And we really need to differentiate that from acute stress. Acute stress is, the sudden spike of adrenaline when you swerve to avoid a car crash. It spikes, you survive, and it dissipates.
The threat goes away.
But the stress of the totalizing work world is the slow, persistent drip of an email notification vibrating on your phone at 9:00 p.m. while you're trying to read a book to your child. It's the ambient dread of that blank spreadsheet at 3 a.m.
And that ambient dread triggers a very specific biological cascade. Because the modern work environment is boundaryless, it creates a continuous baseline release of cortisol and adrenaline. Your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, which controls your stress reaction, it just remains in a state of constant activation.
It never returns to baseline.
Never. And over time, that constant physiological wear and tear is what we measure as allostatic load. A high allostatic load leads directly to systemic inflammation, metabolic dysregulation, cardiovascular issues, compromised immune function.
So the body is literally keeping a biological score of the organizational dysfunction that you're trying to outmanage through sheer willpower. A perfect encapsulation of this dynamic is the whole unlimited vacation policy trend, especially in the tech sector.
Example.
Right. Because on paper, unlimited paid time off reads like the zenith of workplace autonomy. It explicitly removes all boundaries. But the statistical reality is stark. Employees with unlimited time off routinely take less vacation than employees with a strict 2-week allowance.
Because removing the formal boundary doesn't liberate the worker. It constructs an invisible cage.
An invisible cage of social pressure and internalized anxiety. Without a clear structural rule, you're forced to constantly read the room. You have to gauge the unspoken expectations of your peers and prove your dedication. The acceptable amount of vacation basically approaches zero.
You're trying to self-lead in a structural void, and your allostatic load skyrockets while you try to calculate the invisible rules.
And while that invisible cage damages the biological health of the individual, we also have to look at how this hyper-individualized stress impacts the whole system. Like, how does this affect team performance?
We can analyze that dark side of self-leadership through behavioral decision theory. Let's look at how teams function when they're made up of these fiercely autonomous individuals.
Because there's this common assumption in management that if you assemble a team of highly motivated, self-leading individuals, you'll naturally get superior outcomes. The logic is, if everyone is an optimized self-starter, the team will be unstoppable.
But the empirical data shows a highly counterintuitive reality. In organizational psychology, there's this concept of shared leadership. That's when you distribute influence and decision-making across a team rather than giving it all to one boss.
And generally, that improves outcomes, right? Because you're gathering diverse perspectives.
Right, it increases decision comprehensiveness. But, and this is key research demonstrates that high individual self-leadership acts as a strongly negative moderator in that process. When self-leadership is elevated to an extreme within individuals, it actively degrades the quality of the team's collective decision-making.
So the very trait the organization rewards acting as a sovereign, self-directed entity becomes a toxin when you actually need to collaborate.
Because individuals with hyper-elevated self-leadership tend to exhibit severe overconfidence. They have core self-evaluation biases. They've been trained to rely so deeply on their own internal compass just to survive the lack of management that they default heavily to intuitive System 1 thinking.
Referencing Daniel Kahneman's framework. System 1 is the fast, instinctual, automatic mode of the brain. Heuristics, immediate pattern recognition, it's efficient, but highly susceptible to cognitive bias.
Exactly. And because the hyperautonomous individual trusts their own instincts implicitly, which they have to do to survive the void, they heavily overvalue their own limited set of information. They actively ignore or discount external input or contradictory data from their peers.
They suffer from profound information bias.
Right. They operate under the assumption that their piece of the puzzle is the only one required to see the whole picture.
It creates what we might call the room full of CEOs mentality. If every single member of a team is fiercely self-led and entirely convinced of the supreme accuracy of their own internal alignment, the concept of a team just dissolves. It's a collection of isolated silos forced into physical proximity.
It's like an orchestra.
Exactly, the analogy of a symphony orchestra. The beauty of an orchestra relies on subservience to a shared tempo and a collective structure. If every single musician in the strings section insists on conducting their own tempo, convinced their internal rhythm is the most optimized interpretation, you don't get a transcendent symphony, you just get deafening, uncoordinated noise.
And behavioral decision theory provides a specific mitigation strategy for that uncoordinated noise. Structured intra-team debate. Debate is the necessary, friction-inducing counterweight to the dark side of self-leadership. When you force team members into a structure of rigorous, required debate, you fundamentally alter their cognitive processing. You force the activation of analytical System 2 thinking.
Which is the slow, deliberate, effortful part of the brain. It requires a lot of energy, so we naturally avoid it if we can just rely on the fast instincts of System 1.
Right. Humans are neurologically really poorly equipped to spot their own cognitive biases. You can't easily see the flaw in your own logic. But System 2 thinking, when you activate it in a group through debate, allows individuals to detect the cognitive errors in others that they're totally blind to in themselves.
So structured debate breaks the echo chamber of hyperautonomy.
It forces a comprehensive evaluation of the data.
Structured debate cannot occur spontaneously. It requires a functional organizational architecture. You need psychological safety, clear rules of engagement, a mutual understanding of shared goals.
Which brings us to a really critical intersection.
Right. What happens when the environment itself is fundamentally broken, when there is absolutely no structure for debate, but the individual is still aggressively expected to self-lead their way to optimal health and performance? We need to look at Sarah's environment.
Sarah's experience is a chilling demonstration of what occurs when an organization fundamentally breaks the individual through systemic neglect and then attempts to paper over the damage with a wellness program. Sarah was a senior software developer at a really prominent Silicon Valley startup, and the company proudly advertised a radical zero managers policy. They framed this absence of structure as the ultimate collaborative, empowered, flat environment, a utopia for self-leaders.
But the physical reality of her workspace was visceral and grim. Her environment was a perpetually cluttered kitchen table in a small apartment. Her daily fuel consisted of caffeine pills, erratic sleep, and half-eaten takeout.
Because without managers, without a formal structure for conflict resolution or task prioritization, that supposedly collaborative environment rapidly devolved into a Darwinian vacuum.
Lord of the Flies, basically.
The loudest, most aggressive, and most politically savvy voices completely dominated the workflow. And those who just focused quietly on the work, like Sarah, were crushed under the unmanaged expectations of their peers.
She was enduring the absolute absence of systemic support, cynically mislabeled as empowerment.
And her eventual psychological and physical breakdown was not an anomaly. It was the predictable physiological result of a system operating exactly according to its design. But the critical question is how the organization responds to a breakdown like Sarah's.
Yes, they don't reevaluate the zero managers policy.
No, they don't introduce structural support, they introduce a corporate wellness program.
They offer a premium subscription to a mindfulness meditation app. They institute a mandatory yoga hour on Friday afternoons. They offer seminars on building personal resilience.
Exactly. And we really need to critically analyze why these wellness programs fundamentally fail to produce long-term improvements in employee health.
Why do they fail?
Because their underlying premise is flawed. They treat the employee as a broken component to be fixed, rather than acknowledging the toxic, pathogenic work environment that is actively generating the illness.
It functions as a form of institutional gaslighting. The systemic design of the organization makes you physically ill, and then the organization suggests that your illness is a result of you not meditating effectively enough to handle their environment.
Sociologists identify this specific mechanism as responsibilization.
Responsibilization.
Right. It's the deliberate process of shifting the burden of workplace-induced health risks entirely from the organization to the individual worker. By offering resilience training and step-tracking challenges, organizations construct what we call a discursive shield.
A discursive shield that actively obscures the actual causal pathogens of the modern workplace. Excessive workloads, lack of genuine autonomy over the work itself, chronic organizational injustice, and the severe absence of social support.
And that shield allows the organization to maintain a public posture of care. They can point to the meditation app and claim they are investing in employee well-being, while completely ignoring the reality that they are extracting 70 hours of labor a week with zero job security and no clear managerial direction.
We can even view this through the lens of biopower, expanding on Foucault again. Biopower is the practice of modern states and organizations regulating their subjects through techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies.
Right, the control of populations.
In the corporate context, wellness programs often mandate health screenings, collecting granular data on an employee's BMI, blood pressure, cholesterol. The workforce is managed as a collection of physical bodies that must be optimized for maximum biological output.
But we have to weigh that biological optimization against self-determination theory, SDT. This psychological framework posits that human beings require 3 innate fundamental psychological needs to function healthily: autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Meaning genuine autonomy over the execution of your work, the feeling of competence in your tasks, and the feeling of relatedness, being connected, valued, and psychologically safe within a community of peers.
Right. When a workplace systematically thwarts those basic needs by creating a Darwinian vacuum like Sarah experienced, it triggers the cascade of biological inflammation we discussed regarding allostatic load. A 45-minute lunch and learn seminar on eating leafy greens cannot biologically override the deep physiological damage caused by an environment that fundamentally denies you basic human agency and social connection.
Consider this scenario. Imagine a worker whose job requires them to stand completely exposed in a freezing torrential rainstorm for 8 hours a day. They inevitably develop pneumonia. The corporate wellness response is not to build a shelter. It is to hand that worker a slightly more expensive raincoat, perhaps a branded thermos, and require them to attend a mandatory seminar on maintaining a positive mindset during inclement weather.
They are fundamentally refusing to acknowledge that the rainstorm is the problem.
Right. And they are refusing to let the worker come inside. The storm is not an act of nature. It is the organizational environment they designed and maintain.
The raincoat scenario illustrates the immediate physical absurdity perfectly. But to understand the ultimate existential cost of this systemic responsibilization, we need to zoom out even further. We need to look at the totalizing nature of what the German philosopher Joseph Pieper defined as the age of work.
Pieper's analysis really moves us beyond the metrics of stress or biological inflammation. He's addressing the complete totalization of our perceived reality.
Pieper described how the work world has a tendency to become absolute. In this era, the idealized human is Homo laborans, the human defined entirely by their capacity to labor.
And the environment of Homo laborans operates strictly on utilitarian logic and instrumental reason. Every action, every moment, every human interaction is measured solely by its usefulness, its efficiency, and its potential for output.
To articulate how dangerous this reduction is, Pieper borrowed a concept from the pioneering theoretical biologist Jakob von Uexküll, and that is the concept of the Umwelt.
Now, the term Umwelt generally translates from German as environment or surroundings, but Uexküll used it in a highly specific biological context, right?
Uexküll argued that an animal does not perceive the objective holistic world. An animal perceives a highly selective, tightly enclosed reality determined entirely by its vital survival needs.
Like the tick.
Famously, the tick. A tick is blind and deaf. Its entire universe, its complete Umwelt, consists of only 3 distinct signals: the smell of butyric acid emanating from mammalian skin, the temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, and the tactile sensation of hair. That is the entirety of its reality. It is completely bound to that limited sensory input because that is all it needs to survive and feed.
So Pieper's argument, then, is that the modern hyper-optimized, totalizing work world is actively reducing the human experience to an animal-like Umwelt.
That, by demanding total unbroken commitment to productivity and self-leadership, the work world binds the individual so entirely to the process of usefulness that we lose the uniquely human capacity to step back and perceive the world as a whole.
We become trapped in a selective, restricted reality composed solely of targets, deliverables, Slack notifications, and efficiency metrics. Our senses are narrowed to perceive only what is useful for our professional survival.
Which connects directly back to Byung-Chul Han's observation of what he calls the doping society.
A doping society.
When you are inextricably trapped in that utilitarian umwelt, and you begin to experience the inevitable physical breakdown of burnout, you realize there is no outside world to escape to. The work world has consumed everything. So instead of resting, you medicate yourself.
You consume the caffeine pills, the modafinil, the anti-anxiety medication, not to achieve transcendence or pleasure, but simply to force your broken biology back into the machinery of usefulness.
You dope yourself to remain functional within the umwelt. Han describes this state as worldlessness. The individual loses the world outside of work.
Wow.
And Piper connected this exact phenomenon of the totalizing work world to the ancient profound concept of acedia,
Which, in contemporary language, is often lazily mistranslated as sloth or mere idleness.
Right, but the original theological meaning of the word was much darker. It meant the sadness of the world. Critically, Piper noted that acedia does not manifest as someone lying in bed doing nothing. It manifests as restless, frantic, ceaseless activity.
A desperate flight from the self.
Exactly. The individual throws themselves into endless tasks to drown out the self-reproach of a soul that realizes it has lost its connection to anything higher, anything more meaningful than mere survival and output.
And that manifestation of acedia as frantic activity explains so much of our modern behavioral norms. Look at how corporate culture views the concept of multitasking. The ability to juggle 5 different digital streams, to type an email while actively speaking on a Zoom call and monitoring a group chat, is held up as the absolute pinnacle of human evolution and professional value.
It's heavily rewarded.
But if we analyze multitasking through the biological lens of the umwelt, we see something entirely different. Multitasking is not an advanced human trait. It is a primal, animalistic survival mechanism. In the wild, an animal is required to multitask. A grazing animal must chew its food while its ears constantly swivel to monitor for predators, its eyes scanning the horizon. It exists in a state of perpetual, exhausting hypervigilance.
Because it has to survive.
Right. Multitasking is the exact opposite of the uniquely human capacity for deep, immersive, useless contemplation. By glorifying frantic multitasking, we are celebrating our regression into a state of animalistic hyper-awareness, entirely bound to our survival within the corporate umwelt.
If we synthesize this extensive analysis, tracing the trajectory from Foucault's governmentality and the internalization of power through the severe biological realities of allostatic load, and finally to Piper's concept of the totalizing work world, we arrive at a definitive conclusion regarding the modern workplace. The contemporary obsession with self-leadership and total autonomy, when it is deliberately detached from structural support and coherent management, operates not as a tool of empowerment, but as an ideology of abandonment.
It effectively replaces the necessary architecture of management and organizational responsibility with a Darwinian vacuum, leaving the individual exposed and unsupported.
It serves to deliberately mask deep systemic failures as personal, individual shortcomings. And perhaps most destructively, it aggressively repurposes profound philosophical concepts, whether that is classical self-governance, stoicism, or the basic human desire for autonomy, as mere instruments for corporate extraction. The system achieves its ultimate efficiency by responsibilizing the individual for their own exploitation.
The ultimate result of this ideology leaves the modern professional existing in a state of profound metaphysical homelessness. We are wandering through a totalizing work world that demands every ounce of our psychological and biological energy, yet provides no structural grounding or genuine support in return. We are forced to be the masters of a ship that has no hull. True autonomy, therefore, cannot be found within the definitions provided by corporate self-leadership manuals. True autonomy is not the ability to survive structural chaos through endless, frantic self-optimization and biological doping. True autonomy is the capacity to step outside of that utilitarian umwelt. It is the ability to clearly recognize the intentional limits of the achievement society, to refuse the totalizing demand that every human action must be useful, and to reclaim the deeply human space of contemplation, a space that absolutely refuses to be measured, optimized, or consumed by the machinery of work.